We'll hear shortly from Edwin Farker, Tender and Sustainability Manager at Michelin. We'll then move into a panel discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined for this by Alan Campbell, Managing Director of Sony, Roger Henderson, Network Assets Director at NIE Networks, and Robert Best, Director of Engineering at Wrightbus. We'll then conclude today's event with an interview featuring Norman Crowley, who I was delighted to speak to a few days ago. The aim is to finish today at 3:30 at the very latest. Now, as you know, this is a Zoom event, so I would ask you to mute your microphone and also to turn off your camera if you don't mind. So, to kick off, I would now like to introduce Alan Campbell, Managing Director of Sony. Alan has more than 20 years' experience working in the electricity industry and was appointed Managing Director of Sony in June this year, following 9 months in the role in an interim capacity. Alan was also appointed to the Sony board in December 2020. Alan, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much indeed, Jamie, for the welcome, and I'd like to extend that welcome to everyone on the forum today joining the call. Today promises to be a really exciting event, looking at how innovative Northern Irish companies are looking to prepare for the future of clean transport. Thanks as well to Chris and the team at the Chamber for organising what's promising to be another terrific event. Sony is really pleased to be a partner of that event. I'm really working together with our colleagues today, Roger at NIE Networks, Robert of Wrightbus, and of course Norman. Really appreciate them giving their time today to share their pioneering visions for the future for the sector. And again, Jimmy, appreciate yourself for chairing the event today. Northern Ireland, everyone will know, has a unique industrial heritage. We're highly classed in manufacturing with great skills in engineering and design. But today we're also seeing burgeoning skills in our digital and data industries. And together, along with the innovative energy sector, we can draw on all of that expertise and look forward with a lot of optimism at being able to deliver on Northern Ireland's energy ambitions. Here in Northern Ireland, everyone will be aware that we have the raw materials, the wind, the tides, and yes, indeed, even now and again some sunshine. And all of those resources mean we have that promising future, but there will be a lot of work in actually delivering there. Sony is really proud of the work that we're doing in planning and operating the transmission system. It's really going to look to deliver on what Northern Ireland can do to as well support that delivery of the clean transport sector, but as well delivering wider on that and just in terms of Northern Ireland's clean energy ambitions. We already have a world-leading electricity sector. Today we can accommodate up to 70% of renewables on the grid at any one point in time, which is world-leading. We're currently trialling 75%, but to get to 2030 ambitions, we're going to have to push that even further, upwards of 95%. Supported as well as all that renewables, we're going to have to look to support that with clean gas, interconnection and storage facilities to be able to manage that secure energy transition. We're in a period full of challenge, as I mentioned, but it's also full of opportunity. The latest DFE figures, as many will be aware, showed that in the 12 months up to June of this year, 45% of Northern Ireland's energy came from renewable sources. This is a real testament to the work being done across the industry by Sony, NIE Networks, of course the government and the regulator as well. So it's, as I say, it's a testament to all involved. But to move to the 70% renewables target that's been signposted as part of the DFE's recent energy strategy options consultation, it's going to be, I say, a big challenge. And yet we've only 8 years to deliver on it. Along with many of you, we're looking forward to the publication of the DFE's energy strategy in the coming weeks. In advance of that, Sony will be publishing our Shaping Our Electricity Future roadmap. This is our plan for how we're going to transform the electricity grid, the markets, and indeed our system operations to be able to deliver on the DFE's energy ambitions. Really appreciate, I know there's a lot of people on the forum today that actually contributed to our consultation, so really appreciate that and thank you, and we're looking forward to rolling out that plan in the coming weeks as well. In terms of the modelling that we did with all the feedback we got from our Shaping Our Electricity Future project, it shows that to deliver a 70% target of renewables by 2030, we're going to have to almost double the amount of renewable energy sources on the grid. As well as that, we'll be looking to see almost 300,000 electric vehicles on the roads in Northern Ireland by then. Incorporating a large amount of electric vehicles in a relatively short period of time is a challenge, but it's something that, along with ourselves, NIE Networks, as I mentioned, government and regulators, we'll be looking to make sure that the transmission grid and the distribution grid are ready for that transition. And just to allay any concerns, we're ready on the case in terms of how we're going to go about that. In particular, Sony and NI Networks have been looking at how we're going to ready the grid in the Greater Belfast area to be able to accommodate not just the electric vehicles that we foresee coming on the system, but also the decarbonisation of heating as well. So along with NI Networks, the utility regulator and DFE in the coming weeks, we're going to be announcing a multi-million-pound project to ready the transmission grid in Belfast for that future energy transition. And finally, just when it comes to innovation and clean transport, we're already seeing that move at pace and economic opportunities developing from that. I was really interested to read NI Networks and KPMG's recent report into the decarbonisation of heat and the energy sector in Northern Ireland, that it creates somewhere in the region of 5,000 jobs, a boost to the economy of nearly 19 billion. This is gross value added, and this is over the next 20 years. So it puts Northern Ireland in a really, really positive place. So look, to wrap up, I'm really looking forward today to hearing from the contributors in terms of what they have to say in terms of their innovation and vision for the future. It's an exciting time, it's a rapidly evolving sector, and just to reassure you, Sony will be continuing to work with our partners in terms of that journey. Thanks very much, Jamie, and look forward to the discussions later on.
Thanks very much, Alan, for providing that very useful context. I would now like to introduce our first guest speaker, Edwin Farquhar, Tender and Sustainability Manager at Michelin, who has an address entitled People, Profit, Planet. The French multinational tyre company has evolved beyond tyres through a sustainable approach which consistently pushes the company to find an optimal balance between personal fulfillment, people, economic development, profit, and safeguarding the Earth and its inhabitants' planet. I'm delighted Edwin will now join us to share the company's current objectives at a global level, right through to its local sustainable projects in the Ballymena area. Of course, if you have any questions for Edwin, please feel free to submit them via Zoom, and I will try to get through them, time permitting. Edwin, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for that grand introduction, and yeah, I hope I can do the slot justice, so thank you for having me indeed. I suppose the best way to start this is to echo the introduction, which is we are a global business, and so decisions are made on a global level, and sometimes I said that's kind of difficult to translate, but what I'm trying to do today is, with the 15 minutes that I have, is try to give you a better idea of what our ambitions are around sustainability and sort of a cleaner future for transport, but this really is a drop in the ocean. So what I'll do is I'll start at the top and we'll work our way down. So the top really is the message from our CEO, Florent Menegaux. Tomorrow, everything will be sustainable at Michelin is the message, and that conviction is the backbone of our vision as a company. So everything will be sustainable. It means that the Michelin Group is committed to a profitable development for the company and its employees with the greatest respect for our planet and its inhabitants. So how do we do that? So that's the strategy. What we need to do is talk about the tactics. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is that we're on a journey to becoming all sustainable. And the tyre industry, so it's probably not the cleanest industry in the world, or not seen as the cleanest industry in the world. But really, as a company, Michelin's hands are rooted in the earth, as in nature, because our raw material, latex, comes from trees. So the group's all sustainable vision informs strategy and strives for the best balance, as I've already said, between people, profits, and the planet. So for people, this means development, personal development, a commitment from the company, safety, the inclusion of diversity in all its forms, and value creation for our customers. For profit, obviously it means growth, financial value, the brand power of Michelin, and innovation in terms of our products, our services, and our solutions. And for the planet, this means achieving carbon neutrality after factoring in manufacturing, energy consumption, the product use, so when it's actually fitted to cars, vehicles, trucks, aeroplanes, motorbikes, anything else that we make tyres for. And then our environmental footprint in terms of our biodiversity and product circularity. Now, the environmental footprint in terms of biodiversity and product circularity are kind of very, very important to us. And they're topics that I'll kind of touch on as we go through the slides. But so much of what we see today is based around carbon neutrality, CO2 being obviously the biggest contributor towards sort of like the warming up of our planet. But biodiversity is equally important for our health and well-being. So the group shares and upholds a set of deeply rooted values, and they translate really to respect for our customers, respect for people, respect for shareholders, respect for the environment, and respect for facts. So what I'd like to do is talk you through some of the the very kind of tangible things that we're doing in and around the business to move to our all sustainable vision. So the first one I'd like to talk about is our ambitions around tyres. I hope I don't need to introduce the business too much to all of you today. Michelin is a global tyre manufacturer, as you all know. We provide tyres for MotoGP as one kind of sort of a blue ribbon sort of series. But we are, I think, we're the number one tyre manufacturer on the planet, probably behind Lego in terms of sheer numbers. That's a useless fact for everybody. But the company's history goes much further than that, really. We started manufacturing tyres back in the late 1800s, and we've been manufacturing tyres ever since. Now, when we first started manufacturing tyres, there wasn't that many cars on the road, there wasn't much tyres in use. So one of the things that we tried to encourage was people to get out and about in their motor vehicles more, to use their motor vehicles. And as a result of that, people got in their cars and drove around. Now, the way that we encouraged that was to come up with what was called the Michelin Guides, or the Michelin Star system, which you probably know as well for restaurants. So that's one of our innovations as well. Now, what we did was came up with a methodology where you could either give 1 or 2 or 3 stars to a restaurant, depending on the caliber of the food that you're going to get served. So 1 star meant that you would, if you were on a journey from A to B, it was worthwhile stopping along that journey to eat in this place because the food was particularly good. A 2-star restaurant, if you were on a journey from A to B, meant it was worthwhile a slight detour going out of your way to eat there because the food was particularly good. And a 3-star restaurant was basically worth a journey in itself. So that's kind of how the guide system came into effect. So suddenly Michelin had people buying their guides, driving around the countryside in France, looking for places to kind of go and eat and to visit. But at that moment in time, there was no road signs. So people would get lost in the French countryside and not know where to go. So another one of our innovations that we had to come up with was road signs that basically told people where to go. Now, all of that might seem slightly out of context, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that the company has always kind of innovated. One of the results of putting tyres onto vehicles is mobility. And Michelin very much sees itself as a company based around sustainable mobility and not necessarily tyre manufacturing. So we'll go through the ambitions around tyres, which is the core of our business. I'll go through the ambitions beyond tyres, which is really where the future is, as I said, in terms of our kind of sustainable. So in terms of manufacturing, just to give you some headline figures, around 646 million euros was invested in research and development in 2020 alone. And the objective for 2050 is to make all of the production plants, supply chain operations, and raw materials and component inputs carbon neutral. That's everything that we do. Now, to give you 3 kind of very sort of like quick examples of it, so this is the introduction to kind of the culture of the business. The first one, as I said, on the left-hand side of your screens as you're looking at it, is a tyre of the Michelin e-Primacy range. Now, the e-Primacy was launched to great fanfare in November 2020. And it's the first tyre that carries an environmental product declaration, which basically means that it's absolutely carbon neutral at the point of purchase. So the tyre, the manufacturer, all of the raw materials, all the supply chain activities that have gone into that tyre, right up to the point the consumer purchases it, is completely offset by the business. It's a world first. Now, what we're aiming to do, as I said, is to increase more and more the ranges of our tyres actually do that. So one of our products, as we talked about, is or ambitions is to be completely carbon neutral in terms of our manufacture. The second point I talked about, which is again moving away from the carbon neutrality, which is kind of a major component of greenhouse gases, etc., is actual biodiversity. And the next 2 commitments from a manufacturing perspective are completely geared towards that. So the first one is that we work in partnership with the World Wildlife Foundation. As I've already mentioned, Michelin's hands are in the soil, basically. Our history is rooted in nature because that's where our raw material comes from, latex. And between 2014 and 2018, we actually introduced or reforested a surface area of around about 88,000 hectares of woodland or tropical rainforest in this effect, because the Brazilian rubber tree Hevea braziliensis, which is the tyre that produces latex that we use, grows in those tropical climates. Now, to put that into context, 88,000 hectares represents an area probably about the size of Hong Kong. And what we basically do is to manage our plantations, I said, so that they maximize their yield, because what we found after many years of research is that monocropping and that monoculture really doesn't work, for us, or for the rubber trees. They're much happier when they're surrounded by natural kind of forest partners, as I said, in terms of the biodiversity you'll find. Which brings me on to the next point, so the issue of biodiversity. So we reforested, but we just didn't reforest with all of the trees. I said that we needed to produce rubber. We reforested them in a way that makes those trees thrive, okay? But the issue of biodiversity is on every annual general meeting with the Michelin External Stakeholders Committee. We're actually part of a campaign called Act for Nature. So we talk about biodiversity at every single one of our board meetings. We talk about how it's affected by our products and the practices that we have to employ to get the raw material into our factories to produce the products that we sell. So from a manufacturing perspective, we're aiming to be carbon neutral. We're reforesting wherever we can, and that reforesting reflects biodiversity that would have been there present in pristine conditions. That's part of it. The second part, and probably the most critical phase really, is the usage phase. So this is when the tyres are actually fitted to our vehicles. The lighter, safer tyres deliver long-lasting performance. Maintaining and repairing and retreading tyres, this is from a truck perspective, and services and solutions that improve the safety and efficiency of transportation. So the first product that we've got on the left-hand side that we talk about in usage is the Ultraflex technology that significantly reduces coil compaction. So this is one of our agricultural products. Now, effectively, because of the soil compaction or the lack of soil compaction by these products, there was a university study done in America. And what it basically found out was that it could improve yields by around about 4%. That basically means that the product would pay for itself several times over by fitting them on their vehicles in terms of what the farmers could actually get out of the field itself. We think that's an incredible result, really. So then another one of the ways that we're innovating in terms of our products and what's happening. Again, as I said, what we're aiming to do now is to make those products carbon neutral at the point of purchase. Then we talk about our truck tyres. Now, our truck tyres work on the basis of what we call the 4 lives principle, where they're able to be regrooved and retreaded multiple times. Now, our remix process uses about 70% fewer materials than a brand new tyre. So an example there that we've got is Yodel, one of our customers, where they use about 4,000 tyres a year. And because of the remix tyres that they're using, it's about 70% fewer raw materials that they're actually using and lowering CO2 waste. Now, it just so happens as well that our remix facility or retread facility is based in Stoke-on-Trent. It's somewhere that we encourage people to come and visit and see what we're doing and how that actually works. And then the final one, again, so it was an innovation, I suppose, so back to kind of innovating, and that's developing airless tyres. Now, if customers didn't have to put air in their tyres and have punctures, I'm pretty sure that we would manufacture or required to manufacture a few tyres that we couldn't have. And that's why we developed the airless tyre. Now, this was part of a vision concept. It was originally launched about 5 or 6 years ago, an event that we host every year about sustainability called Moving Up. And again, having the correct amount of pressure in your tyre, improving fuel economy and promoting wear. So not only do we have to manufacture less tyres because they get less punctures and less damage, but because of the way the tyres are manufactured, they would always have the correct amount of pressure for that vehicle in its actual usage phase, and it would have an effect on fuel consumption and everything else. So again, really targeting the usage phase and how we manage to long-lasting performance in everything that we do. And then the final part of that, which is kind of bringing or everything together, which is kind of the circular economy that we're talking about, is the end of life phase. And in this, we are acting as a unifying force, developing innovative partnerships across a diverse range of technological disciplines. We're creating and developing recycling systems for end-of-life tyres and plastic waste. So again, back to our strategy, we're building our long-term roadmap, and it incorporates increasing amounts of sustainable materials over time towards 100% by 2050. Now, what that basically means is that we are reclaiming materials from, for example, PET waste, but we're also collecting end-of-life tyres. And we're actually buying and developing processes where we can take end-of-life tyres and incorporate them into newly manufactured tyres. So again, using no virgin materials. We're also helping reduce the amount of raw material needed in tyre production. So Lehigh Technologies is a company that we've acquired that actually helps us to recover the materials that we need to go into our new tyres. And we've got another joint venture with a company called Enviro, and they've designed a process which will recycle everything in an end-of-life tyre, and a further illustration of the group's expansion in sustainable materials. So in terms of our circular economy, bringing all of that together, we're actually taking end-of-life tyres and they will be incorporated into any new tyres that we manufacture with the ambition to be 100% sustainable by 2050. Now, all of that is around tyres. So, but in order to do that, we've had to diversify, and we also have ambitions beyond tyres. We've already talked a little bit there about recycling end-of-life tyres, which the picture on the left-hand side illustrates. So working with the recycling industry to encourage recovery and reuse of end-of-life tyres. We're also massively invested in hydrogen as an alternative fuel to move away from hydrocarbons. And hydrogen is the key to achieving the Paris Agreement objectives now. It's appropriate for all uses, eliminates CO2 emissions, improves air quality, and infers the energy transmission. Michelin has been working on this technology for more than 15 years. And again, we have another joint venture or an incubator program with a company called Symbio, where we actually manufacture hydrogen fuel cells for use with electric vehicles as range extenders, as onboard recharging facilities, so which seems to be kind of the best hybrid of the two technologies to actually work together. Our strategy is to use our outstanding experience in the design and production of high-tech materials. Obviously, rubbers and polymers, as I said, like in terms of how they are molded, it's classed as high-tech materials. So any use that we can think of to use our expertise, we're doing that. It's already a core factor in the performance of the group's tyres. These being capabilities are enhanced by our research and development program, incubators and targeted acquisitions. They are also being marketed to customers in other industries, so specialised subsidiaries and joint ventures. So again, sharing our expertise and acting as this unifying force for creating change in the industries that we work in. We've talked a little bit about clean and biosourced materials. So new supply chains are emerging for biomaterials, which replace fossil materials with renewable resources. And the group wants to be involved in supply chains that are critical for its core business. It also aims to achieve world leadership in the industry, which offered new kinds of biosourced elastomers and monsters. And then the final one, which is probably a little bit unusual, is 3D printing and 3D metal printing specifically here. 3D printing is we've used for a long time to actually make the molds that generate our sculptures in the tyres. But again, we're finding lots and lots of other uses for that in kind of biomedical, in terms of components for sort of like high-tech materials and high-tech machines. And we are the leader in 3D metal printing for industrial design. We're a major player in metal additive manufacturing. That leadership position comes thanks to our technical expertise and our industrial experience in mold design. In 2015, we partnered with Fives, the leading designer and manufacturer of industrial machinery, to find our expertise with theirs and founded AddUp, which is a website that you can find, which will give us an idea of what we're doing and beyond it. So that's my 15 minutes up. I hope it was kind of informative. I'm really sorry that I had to rattle through so quickly, but 15 minutes really is a drop in the ocean. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thanks very much, Edwin. So to some questions, and I suppose one of the things that occurs to me is I imagine that when literally the rubber hits the road, there is an impact that the tyres might have on the environment at that point. And how do you minimise that impact if it exists?
Okay, so I think what you're alluding to really there is tyre road wear particles. So you actually mean as a tyre sort of like wears over its life? Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, again, we fully acknowledge that the issues kind of in and around tyre road wear particles. And we've actually been researching this probably for the best part of about 20 years. Now, what I can say, sort of like in all honesty, is that what we're talking about is a mixture of the rubber from the tyres and the road material and the substrate itself. So it's not predominantly rubber. And we recognise, I said, that we're kind of tarred with that brush, the same as everybody else. Now, what is interesting, I said, is because of the size and the weight of those tyre road wear particles, they generally don't move very far away from the roads, so to speak. But it's not as if they're kind of very light and they're going up into the atmosphere. It's not as if they're kind of being washed into kind of marine environments or to marine ecosystems. Generally, where they come off the tyre, that's where they stay. Now, as I said, we've been working with other tyre manufacturers for around about 20 years as part of a kind of a global initiative on this. And whilst we kind of acknowledge that there is an issue there, it has been kind of pretty overstated by press in terms of kind of its actual spread away from kind of the areas where it's used. It's just something we can't get around. And again, going back to our kind of principles as Michelin, we design tyres to last as long as humanly possible, so to be reused again and again and again. What we're trying to discourage, I said, is tyres that aren't manufactured to have long-lasting performance and aren't kind of designed to give the maximum sort of like bang for the buck, so to speak. because it's those kind of cheaper end of the tires without kind of wanting to point the finger that generate the bigger portion of the problem, because they wear faster, so they tend to kind of like use materials rather than kind of natural latex. So it's a similar type of rubber derived from crude oil called butadiene. And again, so that kind of all sort of like adds up to another impact. So to kind of answer your question, we're well aware of it. We understand its kind of impacts on the environment and kind of ecosystems, but there isn't really a great deal that we can kind of do about it at this moment in time, other than kind of measure, monitor, report back, and let people know what the issue is.
Okay. Can we go from global to local, as it were, and find out something of what your fund is doing and helping drive economic development in the greater Ballymena area?
Yeah, of course. Well, basically, I said, like, as I don't know kind of how many people know, we had a factory in Ballymena, and it unfortunately had to shut down because the demand for the particular kind of dimensioner tire just wasn't there anymore. And being a Western outpost in Europe, I said, obviously logistics costs were high, etc., etc. And one of the fundamental drivers inside Michelin is competition between factories in terms of kind of maintaining sort of cost and standards and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the background behind the Ballymena factory closure. Now, the commitment from Michelin, which again, I suppose falls under kind of the people, profit and planet aspect, and if we focus on people, the commitment from the group was to replace every single job that was lost, either by direct placements within the Michelin business or by having development fund that supports startup businesses in and around the Ballymena area that contribute towards sustainable mobility. So one of my colleagues who actually invited me to speak here today, a chap called Noel Mulholland, actually heads up that development fund. And as part of this, what we would really like to do is to hear from kind of, I suppose, local businesses or local entrepreneurs who have any kind of development or aid that could work towards those sustainable mobility goals. And what we basically have is this investment in an incubator kind of program available to those people to actually say, how is this going to affect the local economy and our global ambitions going forward? So it's a commitment to people, again, from Michelin, that kind of follows through on our sort of like corporate social responsibility aims.
That's very interesting. Look, we have run out of time. I'd like to ask some more questions, but we have to move on. Edwin, thanks very much for your contribution here today.
No worries. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so we're moving on to our next session in this presentation, and it's a chance for you to put questions to our panelists. We have 30 minutes. Use the chat function to post your questions. We really want to have a good discussion here, and you can help by putting your queries through to me, and I will relay them to our guests, who are Alan Campbell, Managing Director of Sony, Roger Henderson, Network Assets Director at NAE Networks, and Robert Best, Director of Engineering at Wrightbus. So I want to start with you, Alan, and of course, the electrification of transport is likely to be, in fact, it's pretty certain to be a key element of the forthcoming Department for the Economy Energy Strategy. That's going to impose challenges on Sony. How will you meet those challenges?
Well, what's important to say is that, yes, there'll be challenges there, but it's a great thing for Northern Ireland in terms of decarbonisation. We don't expect the change to be, it's not going to be a cliff edge as such, so there's going to be a long time to lead into this. We're going to have years to actually see what's happening and then plan for it and actually manage it. I mentioned earlier, or shaping our electricity future roadmap, and that looks at, as I say, the number of cars, electric vehicles that could be, starting to be used, and how we need to get the grid ready for that. Part of that's bringing in new renewable generation to help meet that demand, but also looking at how minimizing cost is also a key factor in terms of how we do it. So, I think we have the time to do this. Other countries are ahead of us in terms of that transition. So there's a lot to be learned from what's happening in those other countries. I was just interested to read that I think Norway leads the charge in this. Something like over 80% of their vehicles sold are electric vehicles in the last year. So there's going to be a lot to be learned from other players. So it's a global challenge. And look, as I said at the outset in my opening, Northern Ireland has a great position in terms of its skill sets, and particularly in the data and digital sectors to be able to help harness that. And where there's challenges, there's opportunities. So there's going to be opportunities for people to come into the market and actually help us manage that. So, moving, electric vehicles to when they're being charged to do it off-peak times, there'll be people come in and actually help motorists actually do that and manage that. And it could be opportunities for the motorists themselves to actually participate in the electricity markets in terms of how they could actually potentially get rewarded for charging in off-peak times. I think there is a misconception that everyone will come in at 5 p.m. on an evening and plug in their vehicles. Realistically, we'd expect that to be done over the course of a week and at off-peak times as well. So I think whilst there will be challenges, I think we'll have a lead-in period to actually learn and develop, working in conjunction with the likes of NI Networks in terms of how we actually do that.
Yeah, we'll explore some of those possibilities that you've just adverted to there shortly. Now, of course, our take-up of electric cars has been relatively slow so far, but that's likely to accelerate with the ban expected at the end of the decade on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans, together with, of course, the price competitiveness of battery vehicles. So, Roger, those people are going to have to charge up and they're going to need charging stations. So as a stakeholder in this area, do you have a view on how big the network of charging stations needs to be?
Yeah, certainly, as we move forward and, our forecasts are sort of looking at sort of numbers of out to 2040 of potentially like 1 million, EVs or whatever to be charged up. And as such, the charging stations associated with that are probably in the order of about 5,000 and, the order maybe 100, 150 rapid chargers. So in terms of like the network as such, what do we need to do in preparation for that? And, there's probably various stages of that, in relation to the home charging and facilities there. Obviously, we need to reinforce and invest in terms of the network to ensure there's capacity at the home charge place. And already we've sort of, with engagement with the regulator, received an additional £8 million of funding to avail of additional support in terms of providing that capacity. We also then need to look at the infrastructure required to provide, the rapid charging, etc. And that obviously is going to be a bit more robust because of the size and extent of those chargers as such. I think then we need to sort of very much get focused upon, the smart solutions, the innovation around the charging technologies. Certainly from a network provider, where we're looking to is to optimize, the demand on the network coming from these chargers as such, so that they're not all sort of accumulated in the one point, and how we sort of build diversity and use smart charging technology to minimize the amount of investment required on the network. And then following on from that sort of intervention, I think it's around how we facilitate and develop the market so that the user, the consumers can not only sort of avail from the use of their electric vehicle, but start to engage actively in the market. And that's really where, in terms of electrification of transport, it can be more transformative in terms of how we go about and using our energy, and basically start to involve customers actively engage in the market and develop those markets. And for example, we've just launched our Flex trial this year, whereby we're inviting consumers to come forward, whereby they can reduce load to try and avoid constraints in the network and trial that. And it's really through the development of those markets going forward that we will optimize the amount of investment required on the network, and as such keep the cost to the consumers to the minimum.
Is there a model elsewhere that we can follow in terms of creating charging stations that might prove useful?
I think it's maybe worth considering sort of, Alan referred to there, like what's happening across the rest of the world, etc. I think there's a lot of lessons can be learned from our more immediate neighbours in terms of the approach in Ireland, the approach in Scotland and Wales. And, in terms of those areas, the governments there have developed a clear strategy as part of their transportation strategy. And if you look at Scotland there, the number of electric vehicles there is probably about double what it is here. But that's clearly down to a coordinated cross-cutting approach, which actually incentivise, the purchase of the cars, incentivise consumers to put in, the home charging points, etc. And also the local authorities in terms of develop their plans So, very much, and similarly in Wales, if you look, earlier this year, they went out in terms of their strategy, and really it's all about trying to build confidence because, I think we have to understand if we just leave this primarily to the remit of the private sector, to develop an infrastructure that will provide confidence to consumers and usability, we'll have to reach out in terms of and recognise, look, we have a huge rural population in Northern Ireland, about 35% of the users are rural based. So how are we going to develop charging infrastructures in those places where the business case isn't obvious? And other areas in terms of like how do we cater for those folk that maybe do not have access to off-street parking, etc. So, there's a clear need in terms of getting that overarching strategy to drive the incentives and arrangements around that.
Okay. We're also going to talk about how Wrightbus will be reacting to the drive to decarbonise public transport. And of course, currently, I think, Robert, it would be fair to say that most of the zero-emission buses that Wrightbus are due to supply to TransLink are electric with only a minority hydrogen fuel cell. But do you expect that current balance that we're seeing in the most recent orders between electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles to be maintained as we go forward?
I see the current ratio, which is of the current vehicles that have been ordered, around 20% of the zero-emission vehicles are hydrogen. I see that ratio being maintained for the next year or two. Beyond that, I see the ratio adjusting to becoming approximately 50-50. And then as we go out beyond 2030, if the trends continue, I'd expect actually the hydrogen vehicles to take over and become the dominant force. The reason for that, quite simply, is that they offer more operational freedom than what an electric vehicle does, and it's much closer to a diesel vehicle from an operational point of view. But having said that, there will always be a place for electric vehicles, I believe, due to some of the advantages that they also have. The key to decarbonising the bus sector is actually choosing the correct powertrain, so the powertrain that gives you the right options and gives you the right cost base. So that's where the challenges really lie.
I think some people might be surprised at you suggesting how hydrogen fuel cell vehicles will come forward, but because they'll be looking to the cost of producing green hydrogen, because that's what we ultimately we want to use in these vehicles. So is the cost of green hydrogen going to go down to, as it were, justify the scenario you're painting?
The key to the entire hydrogen economy piece is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is essential for hydrogen technology to work and to thrive. In terms of the availability of hydrogen, it's all part of the same piece that we're discussing in terms of green electricity and greening the grid and how that whole process works. So if you're using green electricity from a wind farm or from solar farms or other sources, and you're then using that to power an electrolyser to create the green hydrogen, that's a model that works very well and very effectively, and it's coming online in countries around the world as we speak. So there's a reasonable amount of green hydrogen already produced across Europe, and over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, that's going to increase tenfold as the hydrogen take-up improves.
Well, that's interesting. Roger, if I could turn to you, it's sort of a narrowly focused question, this, but I'm sure of intense interest to NIE Networks, and that is this issue of the cost of connecting EV charging stations to the grid, because it's a big cost. Now, do you believe there is an argument for spreading that charge more widely, socialising the cost, if you like?
Yeah, so look, there's probably a number of levels in terms of connection to, the grid as such. There's the home charging scenario, and then, there's the rapid charging. And that's where typically, because you have a number of high sort of capacity chargers within a sort of concentrated area, it's going to require a larger connection and more infrastructure behind that. Certainly, if we look across to GB, their Ofgem have announced that, in relation to those rapid charging sites, that they see the cost of the infrastructure connection. They do want to see that being a barrier in terms of the uptake. So, they're actually taking forward proposals in relation to how that cost would be removed in terms from the connecting party as such. And, certainly that's something that we've been engaging with the FAE and the utility regulator on in relation to how do we remove potential barriers for connection.
Alan, if we could turn to you. I'm I'm assuming, and I think you've adverted to that, at least one of you has, that we will want to incentivize EV owners to charge up at times of low demand, say during the night. Now, that seems to imply time of use tariffs, which would require essentially smart meters. Am I right in my assumption there?
Certainly smart, call them smart meters or some sort of smart charging system would be essential. Probably, like Roger's touched there on, consumers actually actively participating in their, not just their electricity consumption, but also in the electricity markets. Be it, potentially time of use tariffs might be one factor, but we could see, what's termed as sometimes a virtual power plant where someone comes in and, maybe hooks up or connects with a large number of customers that then someone manages that on their behalf. And you get this, basically you're optimizing your demand, and this third party and aggregator could then look at when's the peak demand. Can they shift that demand so that it's not actually occurring at peak times, and then they take the benefit of being able to shift the actual energy consumption within the markets. So there's opportunities there, and where there's a challenge, there's opportunity.
I think in saying that, you're touching on this issue or getting involved in this issue of vehicle to grid, because of course it could be a two-way process. Right, you can presumably you can use the battery in the car to feed into the network where it would be required. So, I mean, some people think so that's been held out as it's a great potential. So you can make money because you'll have that car there, you'll have it charged up maybe with low-cost electricity, and now the grid wants it at peak time, and you can make money out of selling it back to them. But is it realistic? I mean, Roger, do you want to come in on this as well? I mean, but Alan, you start first.
No, I think it's totally realistic. Whether or not it's actual consumer actually selling that electricity back to the grid, but certainly they might be paid a fee or a charge, or not a charge, but they might get an incentive to actually have their vehicle hooked up to their charge point that can actually, as you say, they might be charging at one point in the day and then feeding back to the grid if the grid needs that energy at a more time of demand.
Would you have a problem with coping with that in your NIE networks?
I think, in terms of, as we've sort of discussed there's a progression here in terms of, look, this is the journey as such. So, initially we'll start with tariffs and tariff signals, etc. But where we want to get to is this more active management. And certainly the more data and visibility of data will enable consumers to make more informed choices to offset costs, etc. I think ultimately as we evolve in that journey, then the need for that choice is going to need to be automated, etc. And different players, etc. in the market, and different markets that emerge. And certainly, as I refer to that, Flex is a very keen uptake by participants out in our own sort of community here in terms of starting to actively play in those markets, and that gives them an opportunity to offset costs, etc. So, I think these are exciting times, and certainly the technology will emerge and develop to enable us to do that.
Okay, I'm going to keep you in the hook here because I have a question from Ian Henry from Henry Brothers, and he's asking, when upgrading the infrastructure to cope with the demand from electric cars and vans, how are we going to cater for the whole of Northern Ireland? Because it's been mentioned earlier, we have a widely dispersed population, and getting services to everybody may not be economic. So what do you have to say to Ian?
Yeah, look, what we'll say to that is in terms of, we've started that journey. We've secured an additional £8 million funding from the regulator this year to start to invest in local networks. We're in engagement with the regulator and DFE about further investment, about how we accelerate that. Certainly the energy strategy will give a direction as such, and I think once we get that, we certainly will have a lot more sort of credence in relation to getting and securing that investment.
Yeah, we have a question from Michael Kerr, and if I could perhaps interpret it a little bit, maybe to my own way of thinking, it's about the rising electricity prices, and that, I'm not saying it's thrown a spanner in the works, but it makes the prospect of switching to electric cars a little bit less enticing, and you're having to pay that premium to get the electric vehicle in the first place. So I know it's not. I know it's not your prerogative to talk about these things or to judge whether they're absolutely necessary or to decide if they're necessary. But do we need incentives? I mean, do you any of you believe that we absolutely need incentives to persuade people to buy these vehicles, the electric cars, the hydrogen fuel vehicles, fuel cell vehicles? I mean, is that I mean, stepping outside of your roles, is that going to be a necessary part of the drive to decarbonise transport?
I think maybe speaking from a personal perspective and just kind of my observations on the EV market. Obviously, currently the price point of the cars is generally accepted to be higher than their petrol or diesel equivalent. So that can maybe put some people off. There's obviously then the people that have a concern about the cost of electricity. But ultimately, the cost of that electricity it's a result of largely the wholesale market in terms of gas prices currently. But people probably will see then that fuel prices at the pumps are going to be going up as well. So if people can be getting charging up their vehicle with electricity, it's going to be done in an efficient manner. So the efficiencies could ultimately be more beneficial. And I think as the uptake of vehicles does pick up, we're going to see the price point come down. So that's my one. Whether or not incentives are needed, hard to tell at this stage, potentially.
Okay. Anybody else want to add into this debate?
Well, again, I think it's in relation to the speed and the need for action, in relation to the technology is moving on, and it's moving on fairly rapidly. And Richard's maybe probably closer to some of that than the likes ourselves. But I suppose the real dilemma here is the technology and the cost really reduction there moving forward as fast as it needs to be to really be serious about the climate ambition that we have and the urgency to reduce our carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of those two factors, I think you need some stimulus there initially to accelerate that ahead. Really, you're incentivizing people to sort of step forward. And that's really with the backdrop of what we need to do and not lose sight of the whole objective here is about dealing with the climate issue. And that really demands urgency. So, to a degree, yes, I do think we need to encourage that stimulus to move. Otherwise, it's, certainly the next generation is not going to be thankful.
Sorry, there are probably some incentives out there. But I suppose what I'm saying is, do we need to increase that? But look, it's a debate that really is rests, I suppose, with our politicians. So, Robert, turning to you now. Realistically, we can't have an electrolyser at the end of every street to supply the hydrogen that the fuel cell vehicles will require. So how do we get that energy from where it's been produced to where it's been consumed? Is it pipes would move it along, or is it? Do you see a fleet of tankers moving around the province, bringing the hydrogen to where it's needed?
Sure. I think it'll be a blended approach initially, Jamie. So I think we will see tankers initially, with the logical place to site a larger electrolyzers beside the source of electricity, of green electricity, be that a wind farm or a solar farm or equivalent, and then the hydrogen can be transported to the petrol stations, to the bus garages, wherever it's required in a tanker. I see the next phase from that being potentially the production and the electrolyzers of liquid hydrogen, which allows a more efficient way to transfer by road. And then I also see the possibility to significantly increase the percentage of green hydrogen currently in the mains gas grid as a good opportunity. It's currently capped at 20%. So going forward, if we can increase that significantly north of 20% and use filters to remove the hydrogen from the grid and then fill cars or buses or any other vehicles that way, potentially also to heat homes with it at that point. So I see that being closer to the end game. But until we get to the point where we have the production levels at the right level, I do believe we'll be seeing road transport, as well as some localized small electrolyzers, not quite an electrolyzer at the end of the street, but in certain hubs where it would make sense, you could have localized hydrogen production.
Roger, how extensive will the work have to be to accommodate demand from hundreds of thousands of EV owners? And indeed, although it's not the focus of our discussion today. I mean, there will be heat pumps put on the system. So are we going to see streets being dug up, for instance, and transformers replaced all over the shop, as it were?
I think, there's various levels of that, Jim, as you sort of engage and go through this process. Certainly in terms of capacity, we will be increasing capacity, and, as I referred to there, we've already started that investment process. As well, it's not all going to be just delivered through investment, it's through sort of the smart solutions and optimization that we need to try and manage and as such, optimize the level of infrastructure that we have going forward. But certainly there's a level of investment required, and then layered on that, it'll be a number of sort of smart interventions and how we optimize the network going forward.
Okay, I want to ask you a question about the impact of putting all these vehicles, all these heat pumps on the system in terms of demand. I mean, can the system cope with all this additional demand that we will see from, as I say, the electric cars and indeed the heat pumps?
Yeah, well, look, we've modelled, we've modelled out. We look at the demand expectation forecast, out not just for the next 10 years, but even out beyond, beyond the 2040 and beyond. The next 4 or 5 years is going to be modest growth. I'd say we'd forecast maybe a 5% growth in demand. That'll increase out beyond, to 2030 as the uptake of vehicles and heat pumps, increases. And looking at it from the transmission system operator perspective, we looked how we can plan to accommodate that increasing demand. We'll need to look to accommodate those new renewable sources that need to be built, be it more onshore wind, could be offshore wind, part of that mix, and how we maybe look at further interconnection between the island here and GB and from the island across to Europe to actually meet that increased demand. And as well, we'll need to strengthen the grid here in Northern Ireland. And look, we'll shortly be announcing a project. I mentioned one in Belfast, but we'll be shortly announcing a project to strengthen the grid in the north and west. We call it the Mid-Antrim Upgrade, which is really looking at getting that power from the west of the province, where it's typically generated, that renewable electricity, across to the east and mid-Ulster, where there's a lot of use. So, there'll be time, I say, to actually plan for this and do it, but it's 8 years to get to 2030, and that time frame still is a challenge, which, we work very closely with Roger and his team and actually, getting this infrastructure built, as well as then how we operate the grid and the markets that sit behind it.
Robert, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, we're expecting a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by the end of this decade. But what about buses? When do you think there'll be a cut-off point for the sale of new diesel buses? Now, the government, as I understand, the UK government is consulting on a phase-out date for the sale of what they describe as new non-zero emission buses. So what do you think is a likely date, and maybe the industry gets there ahead of them?
Sure. I think that's a good final point. I think the industry is going to get there ahead of them, primarily due to some of the deregulation that's occurred in GB. So you're seeing a lot of local councils that have been mandating low emissions initially and now zero emissions. So the majority of the larger towns and cities have already started their transition to zero emission, with only buying zero emission vehicles or buying very few diesel buses at this point. I mean, this year, we're producing 70% of our vehicles are diesel vehicles. Next year, it'll be just under 30% of our vehicles will be diesel. So we're seeing a big shift towards zero emission. In terms of when we'll build our last diesel bus, that's a slightly more complicated picture, as there are still some routes and some applications where the zero emission technology hasn't quite got to the level that will work well so far. But the larger areas that have already coped with, I mean, London is 100% zero emission for all new purchases. And I see the diesel side tailing off significantly. So it'll become almost single figures from 2025, 2026, that sort of year.
Thanks. Now, this is a question for anybody to pick up on. And I suppose I'm conscious in posing a series of challenges that you have to meet and problems you have to deal with. We overlook the fact that we're into a new era where which should be positive. We're developing systems which are going to be more friendly to the environment. And do you think there is a risk that message gets lost because we concentrate on, as it were, the potholes in the road, if you could put it like that. Alan, do you have a thought?
I think we need to look and we obviously need to bring the community and the general public along this journey with us, and I think that's certainly something that the DFE will be considering in its energy strategy, is to how we educate the general public as to what we're trying to achieve here and that bigger picture. I mean, Roger talked about it very well in terms of the bigger goal here is the decarbonisation and what that means. And if we don't do this here, then what will the cost be if we don't do it is probably the bigger one, and something that worth considering as well.
Roger, your thought?
Yeah, look, certainly consumer behaviour is key to this, and sometimes, we tend to focus on the engineering side of it and the technical bits around it all. But, even if you look across in terms of England and just consumer behaviour around the fuel shortages, etc., that's the impact in terms of how people's behaviours can shift, etc. So yes, look, I do think we have a job to do in terms of articulating the benefits, the need, etc., and the purpose of what we're doing here. There's huge opportunities in terms of not only in relation to climate and the environment, but even for our own economy and skill development. And to agree, we shouldn't underestimate that, and that really is a positive story. And we need to get that in as part of the narrative as well too.
And at Wrightbus, Robert, are you and your colleagues looking to a brighter future?
We certainly are. I mean, we're trying to recruit just over 300 employees between now and Q1 of next year, taking us back up to just over 1,000 employees based in Ballymena. So certainly we're seeing a tremendous growth off the back of our decarbonising strategy, of our zero emission products. And I think just to touch on the pothole issue, I think that the one piece that still sort of strikes everybody across the piece here is that nobody really wants change if they can avoid it. And if the change is going to be more hassle and more expense for people, then it's always going to be a tough sell. So I think it's a collective approach to try and make sure that we minimise the hassle and we make it as close to cost neutral as possible. And if we hit those two targets, then I think it'll make the transition to this new future much easier for everybody. So I think that's where the real challenges lie collectively.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all my guests here this morning for taking time out to answer the questions that have been provided to us and that I've sort of dreamt up myself. Anyway, so now on to our final speaker. He's a Wicklow-based businessman for whom the term serial entrepreneur fits like a glove. Perhaps I should say a luxury driving glove, because the main focus of his nowadays is cars, and not your standard motors, but top models. He's Norman Crowley, and when I spoke to him a few days ago at his office in Powerscourt Estate, he told me about early influences which helped shape his interest in cars, including a connection between his birthplace and one of the world's most famous motoring moguls.
So I grew up in a tiny village in West Cork called Ballinascarty, and it's where the grandfather of Henry Ford was born. And then he moved to Cork, and then he moved to the US. And so we were always told about this and the history and all of that. And so I was kind of always steeped in it. And then from a very young age, following cars and a complete obsession all my life, really.
In 2019, you launched Electrify, an operation to convert luxury vehicles to high-performance electric models. Tell me why you thought there was a market for this type of work.
It was a combination of a couple of things. I owned classic cars, and for anyone, in particular in Northern Ireland, there's a huge history with tractors and classic cars, and rallying indeed. And I always loved classic cars, thought they were beautiful, but they are all heartbreakers. Like, they will, if you drive them, they just break all the time, even ones that have been done up. And I was just saying, if only you could make them more reliable. And when we convert a classic car, we take it from 2,000 fairly unreliable components to about 90 components. And so you make these beautiful cars much more reliable. And in typical entrepreneurial fashion, the market research said nobody would buy them. And now our business is sold out for the next couple of years in converting cars. But there was another thing as well, which was the original goal was actually to convert not just classic cars, but what we call specialist vehicles. And so while part of our electrified business is converting classics, another part of it is converting things like mining vehicles for industry and stuff like that. So there's more
Okay.
to it than just the classics. Yeah.
But just sticking with the classics, what sort of performance would I get after the conversion?
So if you take something like one that I own myself, it's a 1981 Ferrari 308, the car that was made famous in the TV show Magnum PI. And when I bought that, it was 0 to 60 in about 7 seconds. It had lost some of its horses along the way. And now that car does 0 to 60 in about 2.8 seconds. And so phenomenal increase in speed. And they are, the reason I think they're successful as a business is because they are just stunningly beautiful, because they're beautiful to look at, and now they're fast and reliable. And also a lot of people are like, it's not unusual if you go into the newsagents to get a newspaper to come out and find 20 people around the car. You know, they're very rare still, and they really capture the imagination.
Well, this year you expanded the Electrify brand, introducing the EVA concept. Now, what was the thinking behind that development?
So what we've been doing all the time is converting vehicles that other customers bring to us. So that could be anything from a Mini to a Maserati. And then what we did this year was we felt that there was an opportunity to go much higher end. And so EVA is the high end brand of what we do. It's where we buy a vehicle ourselves and we convert it, but to a very high standard. So at Salon Privé this year, we had 5 examples of that, of various types. And it was a very successful show. We sold about £7 million worth of vehicles off the stand. And I say these are a much higher end price point, anything from £300,000 to 1.2 million.
Well, right now I'm looking on screen at an EVA Editions Land Rover Defender, the Croxford. Now, tell me the story behind this vehicle.
So I suppose the goal of our wider group, be it energy efficiency or or any of the divisions that we have, is to do good. And when we were creating that EVA Defender, we were thinking about what is it that makes these Defenders very iconic, and we were thinking that it was adventure and heroism. And then we were thinking, what makes somebody a hero? And so we were lucky enough to encounter Stuart Croxford, captain in the British Army. And Stuart lost a leg, drove over an IED in Afghanistan, and then when he came home, he overcome quite a lot of adversity. Set up his own business. And so it really appealed to everything from our point of view, like his heroism, his entrepreneurial spirit, his can-do attitude. And so we decided to develop a series of 5 vehicles with Stuart called the Croxford Defender. And then back to doing good, that we would also donate proceeds of that to Blesma, which is the charity that helped him. And so it's a kind of win-win, really.
Well, of course, the Croxford isn't the only EVA Editions Defender. There's a turquoise vehicle now I'm looking at on screen.
Yeah, and we call that the Arctic Defender. And again, there's a very famous ocean swimmer. He was in the press recently, called Sir Lewis Pugh. And Sir Lewis, highlights ocean contamination, ocean plastics. And what we did there was we worked with him to create vehicles that all of the plastic components are made from recycled plastic reclaimed from the ocean. And so that vehicle you're looking at there would have the lowest carbon footprint of any vehicle ever developed in the history of vehicles. So it's a huge achievement.
Excellent. Now, moving to a motor that is simply beautiful to look at, the Art Car, which is adorned with a pop art design. There's a fascinating story here. What is it?
Yeah, so the Beatles in the late 60s wrote a song called A Day in the Life. And that song begins, I heard the news today, oh boy. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. And then one of the lines is, he blew his mind out in a car. And that song is written about a very good friend of John Lennon's called Tara Brown. And Tara was was an icon of the 60s. So the psychedelic colors that you see are all associated with Tara Brown. He was on the centerfold of Vogue, on the centerfold of GQ as the kind of poster child of the 60s. And he got a car, a AC Cobra, and then he got it painted by these very famous artists, Bender, Edwards, and Vaughan. And tragically, a year later, he had a Lotus that he used to race, and he crashed and was tragically killed in London. And when we heard about this story, we heard it actually from one of the Guinness family, because he was heir to the Guinness fortune. And we became obsessed with the vehicle, actually. And so what we did was we built a brand new vehicle from scratch in electric. And we have people that work with us who are ex-Williams, ex-McLaren, so they're well capable of doing this. So this is an incredibly quick car. And then we found that Dudley Edwards, one of the troupe that had painted the original, was still alive. And Dudley agreed to paint this vehicle for us. And as you say, it is the most stunning vehicle. And so that vehicle, the plan was to auction it again and donate some of the proceeds to charity in November. But one of the wealthiest car collectors in the world has made an offer for the car yesterday, actually. And this individual is based in the Middle East. And so it may still go to auction, but I think it's going to get snapped up now. Yeah.
Can you give me an idea of the sort of money that might be paid for it?
In excess of £1 million. Yeah. And there is a thought in our head at the moment, because it's not the original vehicle, but the original vehicle is available for us to buy. So one of the thoughts that we can't seem to get out of our heads is that we would buy the original, which has been painted over at this stage, and repaint it, and then sell them as what's known in the classic car world as the sisters, which would be both the original and the electric sitting together. And for a person with the appropriate funds, that would be an iconic thing to have in their collection.
We're discussing now the Ava Hyper Classics. It's a reimagining of iconic cars. Explain what that involves.
So what we're doing is, it's lovely to be recreating and reimagining these cars, but we do want to build a car from scratch in the Irish market. I mean, the last car that was built from scratch here was the iconic DeLorean, and it would be lovely to start doing that and to build up on the whole island of Ireland a proper automotive industry again, and that's our longer term goal. And so what we're doing there is we're working with some of the most famous car designers in the world, Peter Brock, who designed the Daytona and the Corvette Stingray, and Ian Callum, who's iconic, who designed Aston Martins and Jaguars. And what we're doing is developing a new range of vehicles that look like they're classic, but actually they have the performance of a hypercar. And that's what we're building. And early next year, we will release the first images of those cars. And then for the middle of next year, we will actually release the first cars. And the first car we're doing is a reimagining of a car called the Daytona, which is a most beautiful race car, raced in Le Mans in the mid-60s, designed by Peter Brock. And also a very similar version of the Daytona was the cause of speed limits being introduced in the UK, actually. So it's a very historical car, but this will be a modern take on that vehicle.
Now, this is all very interesting, but one wonders about, if you like, the practical application of this to business. And I'm wondering if your techniques can be applied to the ordinary standard vehicle, and if so, what's the scope in that direction?
So the idea of doing the high-end cars first is that it brings revenue into the business as we're building up the business. And also it allows us to lower the cost of the vehicles, because the more volume that you have, then the more you can get costs down. And where it ends in the short term is, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is every mine in the world has what are called light vehicles, LVs. And all of those light vehicles must be converted to electric by 2025. And that's over 1 million light vehicles. And so we've been working with Toyota and working with a bunch of other partners to get a system together that allows conversion. Now, the volumes there would be staggering. Like the conversion, even for our factories in Ireland, the volumes would be like 30, 40,000 vehicles a year. And so that's one practical example of where converting specialist vehicles is very important. And then likewise, even something as simple as an ambulance, right? So ambulances will have to go electric, but fitting out an ambulance is a very expensive endeavor. And so converting them makes quite a lot of sense. And then finally, and there's opportunities in Northern Ireland for this that we're working on at the moment, is you'll have a lot of electric buses now. And so the combination of our technology on the energy side with the electric bus offers a whole load of new opportunities. Like you can sell the battery capacity of the bus when it's being charged to help support the grid. And so there's a lot of opportunities, not just the classic cars. And what's interesting from a business point of view with this is that in our energy business, a lot of what we do is it's very exciting from a financial point of view, but it's not very exciting to look at. Like we make software that makes factories more efficient. And so it's quite fun to have the cars, because the cars are very eye-catching and they attract a lot of attention. And then once you have somebody's attention, you can talk to them about something like energy efficiency, which mightn't be as exciting, but is very important from a climate point of view and from a financial point of view.
How much investment do you think this type of work could bring to Ireland, North and South, and how many jobs might be created here as a result of the ideas that you're suggesting?
It's a great question. So if you think about, if you've ever been to Germany and you go to somewhere like the Daimler factory or the BMW factory, you see the scale of the operations they have. Like, they have trains with double deckers full of cars. And the reason they have that is because they have this history around engineering. They know how to make valves for an engine and all of that kind of thing, right? But if you think about the transition now to electric, an electric vehicle has much more in common with a laptop than it does with a 1920 Daimler, right? And so what we're learning more and more is that our skills in Ireland of software, which are absolutely massive. Like I cannot understate our skill set in technology. It's huge, not only just software, but pharmaceutical. And then you think in Northern Ireland of that massive engineering history, which still exists there with companies there. Like you have Bombardier, you have all these different companies, right? And the combination of that software skills and that engineering heritage is huge. And so you're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs ultimately. We've grown out of our first factory. We're in a temporary factory along with our first factory at the moment. And then we're going for planning at the moment for a factory that can build 100 vehicles concurrently. We've grown out of our factory in Wales, right? And they're expanding at the moment. And I don't think that expansion will happen half quick enough. So, the opportunity is insane. And what allows that opportunity to happen is this transition away from traditional vehicles to these electric vehicles, which are entirely different types of vehicles to what would have been there before.
Well, Norman Crowley, thank you for a fascinating insight into your work and the potential for it to expand and create investment and employment here in this island. Thank you very much, Norman.
Well, indeed, that was a fascinating discussion with Norman. Indeed, the conversations I had with all our panelists, I found very stimulating. I hope that you found it rewarding. I certainly did, and I'm pleased always to participate in these events because I learn so much. It's always a learning experience, an education, if you like. So on behalf of the Northern Ireland Chamber, I would like to thank once again all our speakers and panelists for joining us here today. And also a big thank you to all of you for joining us here, and to Sony, of course, for its support of the Energy Forum. If you don't mind, I would ask you to take a few seconds, please, to complete the event feedback survey, which you should now see on your screens. Your feedback is extremely important for shaping these events in the future. I want now just simply to thank you and to ask you to enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.